feedback, such that should be a very short talk. Isn't that a contradiction of terms? You mean they found one? And there's like a book a month that sort of piles on and these unflattering portrayals. The primal teen, that's actually not too bad, but Mom, I hate you, get out of my life, but first drop Cheryl and I off at the mall. Now I know why tigers eat their young, or right to the point, yes, your teen is crazy. But with the technologies such as magnetic resonance imaging, we can, for the first time, look under the hood at the living, growing brain. And what we've found is that not only do teens have brains, but they're good brains. They're as they should be. And they're not broken. And I'd go so far as to say, if they weren't the way that they are, we wouldn't even be here. And evidence from that comes from a kind of an unlikely source that I'll get to in a minute. So the teen brain is different than the brain of a child. It's different than the brain of an adult. It's not just halfway between. It's kind of its own distinct entity. And it's been exquisitely forged by evolution to have certain features. Behaviorally, the big three are increased risk-taking, increased sensation-seeking, and a move away from parents to peers. And I think these are really deeply rooted in our biology because it's not just humans. All social mammals have these three features. And so we're probably fighting Mother Nature by trying to eliminate these. And this is always very speculative to argue these ways, but one idea is that it helped us get out of the home, which is a really irrational thing to do, right? Wow, people love us, they feed us, protect us, it's a good gig, right? But it turns out it works better if we do. And with less inbreeding, it just sort of, not, I think, morally right or wrong, it just works better if this happens. And so these features, they evolved at a time without firearms, without high-speed motor vehicles, without designer drugs and stuff. So some of these issues are kind of this Stone Age brain and computer age world aspect. But I think that these behaviors have virtues as well. When I was at the NIH, the Smithsonian Museum was sort of close. They had this exhibit, The Hall of Human Origins, which I really liked. It kind of not particularly featured, a little placard on the floor, looked at the relationship between brain size and climate change. And the last big increase in brain size, 500, 800,000 years ago. But what I thought was intriguing was that what correlated was the change in climate, not the degree. So before seeing this, I thought, yeah, it got really cold. You had to be super smart just to stay alive long enough to get food and reproduce. But this is subtly different, that everybody in this room had ancestors whose brains were good at adaptation. And we're really good at it in terms of even compared to our quite close, genetically close, rather than the Neanderthals or Neanderthals. I'll pause. We can edit that later. And we can tell an enormous amount from teeth. And fossilized teeth, which actually redundant. Everybody's teeth right now are fossils, calcified cells. But they work like trees, so they have rings. So tree rings, this was a wet year, a good year of growth, the rings are wider. And across many different species, the rings get closer and closer as you mature. The rings stop and you're done growing, and you're done maturing. And so when you find these fossilized teeth, if you find a fossilized Neanderthal tooth of a 12-year-old, and then check the rest of the cave, he's going to be with his children, not his parents. And this is often portrayed as surprisingly rapid growth in the Neanderthals. But I think that's the wrong way to look at it. What's surprising is our protracted growth. We're the outliers, by far. It's one of the most distinctive things about us. And even across like crows and many other species, the longer you're under protection of your parent, the more complicated your food gathering, your communication, problem solving. Crows are actually really smart, as an example, but similar crows in size and stuff that don't have this protracted maturation don't have those abilities as well. I mean, it doesn't work to just keep your kids at home until they're 40. I don't think on an individual basis it doesn't work, but it's an intriguing trade-off, I think, that we keep options open We keep our brains changeable, see what the environment's going to be like. We can live on the North Pole. We can live on the equator, everywhere. We can even live in outer space for a little while with technologies that our brains have developed. And so this is a good thing, I think, in terms of this ability to keep options open for a long time, but it's really being put to the test with the digital revolution. And this is, just in my short career, it's a game changer. The way that we interact with, like we're doing at this moment, with ones and zeros, and the lights, the projector, it's changed everything. It's changed the way that we learn, and great content that's on the internet. I mean, the greatest minds on the planet a click away, for free. It's amazing. It's magical. The way that we play, and the way that we interact with each other. And so I've been fascinated by this interaction in terms of the biology of this changeability and the technologies that have taken over, and in a sense of, and so the usual question is it good or bad, or and that's the wrong question, right? It's almost any interesting question is, it depends, in terms of in what ways how it depends and what it depends upon. But I think that this is an opportunity in terms of to influence adolescents. One of the tragedies of my profession is that it's almost a 10-year gap between onset of illness and treatment. We need to do better. And I think perhaps the technologies can help us get there in terms of by monitoring things like social media activity, maybe even just movement, GPS data, harnessing these technologies in an ethically appropriate way to help us recognize mental illness so that we can intervene while the brain is still more changeable. And so a lot of the debates around this, that it's just not natural, right? We evolved to talk to each other, to be with each other, share smells and touches, and now we're looking at screens for a big part of the day. But a counter argument to that is, reading is not natural either. Reading is only about 5,200 years old. So most humanity, nobody read. So I don't think that by itself is a good argument. And it kind of makes the point that the whole aspect of this is the changeability. 10,000 years ago, hunting, gathering berries, that's the same brain in terms of, that's a blink of an eye in evolutionary terms. But our brains are amazing. We can adapt. A lot of us spend a lot of our day with symbols, words, and that's so different than what our ancestors did. And so my career has basically been this in terms of trying to understand this plasticity in terms of how to optimize the good and minimize the bad. And this kind of, how do you help people with mental illness? We know. How do we know what we know? What don't we know? Why don't we know that? But my first assumption is the brain's involved. I hope so. If it's like the spleen or something, I'm going to feel like a complete fool down the road. But I think it's a reasonable assumption. And Professor Jernigan began this journey. BJ and I started together at NIH, following down that path of looking at the brain and how the brain changes in both typical development and in illnesses. It's a kind of a non-creative study design, actually, but scan kids, when they're young, and follow them as they go through life, see how they're doing at school, at home, see what sort of influences are on the brain for good or ill. And at the NIH, we did about 10,000 scans, about half the kids healthy, half the kids with different illnesses. And what we found it's nuanced, but the brain doesn't mature by getting bigger and bigger. By first grade, it's already 93% of adult size. It matures by becoming more connected within itself and more specialized. And this idea of being more connected There's many ways you can approach this, but white matter is one of them. So this insulating material that you get 1% to 2% more of in the 4th or 5th decade, the brain is able to communicate a 1,000-fold increase in bandwidth. It's, I think, underlies a lot of the remarkable behaviors that we can do. But it's not just a matter of maximizing speed, it's all about the timing. So the fire together, wire together, the meaning, all the information's in these patterns. But more and more we're understanding that that's the progression. If we look at different parts of the brain, like letters of the alphabet, as we go from an infant to child, latency, teenagers, emerging adulthood, that these letters become words, the words become sentences, the sentences, paragraphs, metaphorically. And this all goes up in adolescence. The brain, almost no matter how you measure it, whether molecular, EEG, blood flow, it's just, it becomes more connected. And this is a kind of a fresh look in terms of this idea of graph theory networks. It gives us a whole new look. So for something like schizophrenia, before we'd be like, is this chunk bigger or smaller or different shape or size? But looking at the same MRI scan, the same data, and looking at how it's interconnected, then we can discern old from young, healthy from ill, schizophrenia. Not perfectly, but it's really exciting for someone like me. I can't do the math, but to be a consumer of it in terms of that, by looking at this connectivity, it gives us a whole new perspective on these illnesses. The other process is the gray matter process, and the 1-2 punch is overproduce and then war, or fight it out. So it's how almost all complexity in nature arises. It's the engine of evolution. Overproduce, something non-random selection, and it has great potential. So it's constantly ongoing. It's not like you only overproduce during childhood and only prune during adolescence, but that we see this upside down U type of curve where as we specialize, the brain actually becomes smaller. So after around 10, 11, 12, your brain doesn't get bigger, it gets smaller, but leaner, meaner, more specialized based on what you're demanding of it. But it's not all parts equal. The prefrontal cortex involved in controlling impulses, long-range planning. It's particularly late to settle down, 25 to 30. And that combined with the hormonally activated, puberty-activated limbic system, the passions, rewards, this imbalance creates a lot of the specialness of teen behavior aspects. But again, this is how it should be. If the prefrontal cortex is already done like 11 or 12 and stuff, then we wouldn't be as adaptable. And so I think this is the tension or the trade-off. The other place to start in terms of that, these illnesses happen at different times. And not perfectly, there's always variation, but Alzheimer's doesn't happen when you're 3, autism doesn't start when you're 60, that characteristically certain illnesses tend to emerge at certain ages. And it's puzzling. Why is that? In terms of, and when you start looking at this, so much happens in adolescence. Not a lot, most. It's up to 75%. And I still don't know the answer. That's been for 25 years. I went like, why? Because the early answer was, teenagers are stressful. It's a stressful time of life. Kids have their parents killed in front of them, or they're starving to death, they're in war, 20 countries, enormous stresses, right? But they don't get schizophrenia. And so that never rang true. And I still don't know, I don't know the answer to this. Why do things happen when they do? And so just one example is for schizophrenia. All of the findings you see in adult schizophrenia, you could predict what if typical teen changes went too far. It's not causal. They already had schizophrenia, but it's sort of so far without exception in terms of both the MRI changes, but also the molecular changes. And so it's just at this point, it's intriguing. It doesn't help me help families with schizophrenia, but I think these are the kind of clues that we're starting to understand. So in this specialization process In typical development, it's about 7% from ages 12 to 17. In schizophrenia, 28%. So it's not subtle, fourfold difference. And so I deal with as an adult isn't an illness. Right? Pregnancy is not an illness, but it's a big deal. Right? Relationships, car accidents, incarceration, life decisions. This happens during adolescence, and it's frustrating. As a physician, it's like there's no insurance, forms to check in terms of for these very real issues that aren't an illness. And this kind of notion is the glass half empty or half full. Because this changeability could be a great opportunity, making it even more tragic that we aren't recognizing the illnesses when they occur. And my final sort of analogy is to use Michelangelo in terms of, this is a very famous painting of his that by design it should look like a brain, the cross-section of the brain. He wrote about it himself and stuff, and it's sometimes called the original synapse, neuroscience humor. But it's not like that. It's much more like his other expression of art, of sculpting. We start with this block of marble and life experiences, so then we eliminate parts. So we might be born with different chunks of marble, sizes from genetics, different. But within each, if we knew what we were doing, if we could guide this process, there's masterpieces, and I think almost everybody, and we don't know what we're doing yet very well. And it's like most of the illnesses emerging, less than 1.5% of the funding has been adolescents. Until finally, now we have this project that for the first time is going to really do this right. 12,000 kids, 19 sites across the country to understand what matters. How does the brain grow in health and illness? Looking at everything we can think of, frankly, in terms of influences on this. I'm going to brag for San Diego a bit in terms of there's these 19 sites across the country, but the coordinating center for the quantitative core and the neuropsych core, and coordinating all the centers, are both here in San Diego as well. What a good deal for us, in terms of the opportunities to try to understand what matters in teens' lives. And so the technologies is a big part of it. How can we get a better sense of internal and external environments with the sensors, with devices they're already using, already wearing? Because this is the crossroads, and this is where people make big decisions about their direction in life. And there's this kind of notion that teens are messed up and they're misguided and stuff. And it's dangerous. And I feel bad because I've, I don't know, people know Jonathan, but this is the crossroads. And what happens is even teens themselves buy into this, right? And like stereotype threat and stuff, if you think that you're, not capable and stuff like that, it matters. Most teens do well. They'll get through this, they'll do well. But I think we do a disservice by selling them short. And I think that, we really need to recognize the huge upsides of this, much more than the downsides, that if we can figure out what we're doing, what matters, we can really make a big difference. Thanks.